Hey there, welcome back to Story Time. This is the 12 and over group, so obviously, again, anybody at any age can listen. The book that we're continuing to read is The Day My Butt Went Psycho. So it's a crazy book. Lots of crazy things are happening. The last time that we had read, Zach was being chased by the butts, and then he was in this area with the prince and Maurice and some other butts, and in came this girl who rescued him. Turns out she is a butt fighter, and her name is Eleanor, and she has some really cool, awesome butt fighter gadgets, including some guns and a cool buttmobile that Zach ended up getting sick in and throwing up all over her buttmobile, and that was really gross. So that's kind of where we ended, where Eleanor they had tried to escape, and or they were escaping, but Zach got really sick over everything. So we are in chapter 3, and this is called The B Team. The prince and Maurice might have been glad to see Zach, but he certainly wasn't glad to see them. As the prince buzzed around him, Zach tried to kick his ugly little face, but he was too fast. All Zach succeeded in doing was kicking off the prince's paper crown. "Dear me," the prince said to Maurice, "that is not a very nice greeting, after all we've done for him." "Perhaps we should teach him some manners, sir," said Maurice. "An excellent idea," said the prince. "After you, my dear Maurice." "That's very kind of you," said Maurice. "Very kind indeed. Very, very—" "Maurice," said the prince. Maurice sped up and launched himself into Zach's stomach. Zach gasped, completely winded. It felt to him like he'd just caught a bowling ball in his guts. And before he could catch his breath, the prince did the same and winded him again. As they repositioned themselves for another attack, Zach put one arm in front of his stomach to protect himself. Maurice's next attack came not on Zach's stomach, however, but on his right hand, the hand he was using to grip the hatch. Oh yeah, he was hanging on the hatch of the buttmobile after it had crashed. Maurice came in hard and fast and over again, while Prince continued to pound Zach's stomach, and the buttmobile plummeted ever faster toward the ground. Zach tried to endure the pain, but he knew it wouldn't be long before his bruised fingers couldn't take it any more. And then he saw them. 3 of the bravest and best butt fighters in the world were speeding up from the ground toward him on flying butts. The B Team. Zach couldn't believe his luck. He had to blink a few times just to make sure he wasn't dreaming. But it was them all right. They were an amazing sight. Zach smiled. They were just like their pictures on the trading cards, and even though they were among the trading cards he'd swapped to get the Butt Hunter's card, he was still very pleased to see them. Leading the charge was the kicker, a large, muscular man wearing a sleeveless black and white football jersey and shorts. He had a big, black, bushy beard, thick black eyebrows, and the most enormous feet that Zach had ever seen. Right behind him was an equally huge woman who was wearing an orange floral dress. She wore her hair in 2 enormous buns, one on either side of her head, and she had her hands like baseball mitts. It wasn't hard to see why she was called the Smacker. Bringing up the rear was a man dressed in a white 3-piece suit. He had a white scarf around his neck and a red carnation in his left lapel. Apart from looking completely out of place riding on a butt, the other striking feature about him was his lips. They were big and red and wet-looking. He was known simply as the Kisser, and he was famous for his legendary kiss of death. The 3 raiders whooshed up through the middle of the pack of butts, sending them flying in all directions. The Kisser grabbed Zach around the waist and shot through the hatch with him. He brought the flying butt to a screeching stop, dismounted, and ran to the front dome, where Eleanor was hanging upside down in her seat, still unconscious. The Kisser climbed into the seat beside her, strapped himself in, and turned the buttmobile 180 degrees. As he did so, Zach fell off of the flying butt and crashed into the floor. right on top of the kicker and the smacker. "Get off my head," growled the kicker. "I'm sorry," said Zach. "It was an accident." "Accident my butt," said the kicker, picking himself up. "I'm going to give your butt a kicking it will never forget. I'll teach you to be a butt sympathizer." Zach backed away from him. The strange, violent man was freaking him out. Now, said the smacker, stepping in between the kicker and Zach. "Nobody's going to kick anybody's butt until we know all the facts." "Kick first, ask questions later," said the kicker. "That's my motto." Right at that moment, a huge butt crashed into the roof. Another butt crashed into the floor. There was silence for a moment, and then they heard a volley of butt fire from the rear. "No, kicker," said the smacker, who quickly pulled the hatch shut. "There's no time for that now. We've got a butt blitz on our hands. They're coming at us from all directions." "Can't this thing go any faster?" bellowed the kicker. "I've got the gas on full already," said the kisser. Zach glanced up toward the front of the Buttmobile and immediately wished that he hadn't. A big, hairy butt had attached itself to the windshield. Zach couldn't recall when he had seen anything so horrible. It made him feel like throwing up all over again. The kicker shook his head in disgust. "Leave it to me," he said. "No," said the smacker. "Too dangerous." "Not as dangerous as flying with a big hairy butt on the windshield," he said. He wrenched the hatch open, pulled himself up through it, and dropped it shut. The butt blitz stopped instantly. Zach and the others watched the kicker clomp along the roof and the front of the Buttmobile until their view of him was obscured by that hairy butt. Suddenly the windshield was clear. The hairy butt obviously booted to oblivion by the kicker, who was standing on the nose of the Buttmobile, grinning wildly and giving them the thumbs up. Zach could see the other butts were keeping a safe distance, just out of kicking range. The kicker turned toward them and beckoned them, daring them to come closer. One did. The kicker booted it so hard that it split in two. Another butt flew in from the left side, but the kicker didn't even blink. He just lashed out with a perfect side kick that sent that butt spinning. The rest of the butts charged in fast after that, as if they were determined to avenge the other butts. But if the kicker was worried, he sure didn't show it. He was drop-kicking and torpedo punting and pirouetting. He looked amazing. The butts were flying everywhere. "Look at him go," yelled the smacker. "That's poetry, that is." Zach wondered what sort of poetry described a brute in a football jersey kicking butts senseless. Certainly not any of the poetry that gave him to read at school. As Zach watched, he noticed that the kisser didn't seem quite so enthusiastic about the kicker's performance as the smacker. He seemed to wince every time the kicker's boot connected with a butt. Meanwhile, one of the butts was orbiting the kicker's head at high speed. The kicker was swatting at it with both hands like it was a particularly annoying mosquito, but the butt persisted, swatting clearly not being the kicker's main strength. All of a sudden, the butt found the opening it was looking for and attached itself to the kicker's face. "Uh-oh," said the smacker. Looks like he's in trouble." The kicker grabbed the butt by its cheek and tried to pull it off, but it was too tightly attached. Meanwhile, the rest of the butts were coming in thick and fast. "I've got to get out there," said the smacker, raising from her seat. She pulled herself up through the hatch. Zach watched her stomp along the roof and onto the nose of the Buttmobile. Then the action really started. He thought the kicker was pretty spectacular, but the smacker was something else again. She rolled up her dress sleeves past her elbows, raised her enormous hand in the air, and put on the most amazing display of slapping and smacking Zach had ever seen. Backhanders, front-handers, slaps, super double front, and backhander power slaps. There wasn't a smack or a slap that she didn't know. She smacked one butt so hard that it simply blew apart, smearing the windshield with brown liquid. "Whoa," muttered the kisser, fumbling for the windshield flusher. When he got the window clean, there was just the smacker and the kicker out on the nose alone. The kicker still had the butt attached to his face, though, and the smacker was holding him by the shoulder and smacking the butt with a front slap on one cheek and a backhander on the other. After almost a minute of this punishment, the butt flew off of the kicker's face. The kicker looked dazed and confused. He staggered backward, and Zach was sure that he was going to step off the nose of the buttmobile until the smacker grabbed him. She threw him over her shoulder in a firefighter's lift and walked back up the windshield and across the roof. Zach opened the hatch, and the smacker lowered the kicker, still dazed, down into the buttmobile. He was in a bad way. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor. The smacker lowered herself down next to him and closed the hatch behind her. "I love the smell of freshly smacked butt in the morning," she said. She went across to the small sink mounted on the wall of the buttmobile and began to wash her hands. I guess it's very important to wash your hands after you smack all those butts, right? Good hygiene. Very important. "Call that smacking?" said Eleanor, pulling herself up out of her seat. "Eleanor," said the smacker, wiping her hands on the front of her dress, "you're awake." The smacker walked across to Eleanor and threw her enormous arms around her. "It's good to see you," said Eleanor after she emerged from a mighty hug. "But why? How did you get here?" "We saw your buttmobile flying upside down. We caught this guy hanging from the hatch, and the smacker," said the smacker, pointing to Zach. "We got here just in time." Eleanor glared at Zach. "You idiot," she said. "You could have gotten us both killed." "It was an accident," said Zach. He seems to say that a lot. "You should have had your seatbelt on," said Eleanor. "I didn't get a chance," said Zach. "You went into that corkscrew thing, and I've got a really weak stomach." "Don't remind me," said Eleanor, screwing up her face. "Aren't you going to introduce us to your boyfriend?" said the smacker, grinning. "His name is Zach," said Eleanor, "and he's not my boyfriend. I found him wandering the streets in the middle of a butt curfew. I saved his life. Biggest mistake I've ever made." "Thanks a lot," said Zach. The kicker groaned. "Is he all right?" said Eleanor. "He'll be fine," said the smacker. "Oh," he said, touching his nose. "What happened? How did I get back here?" "You got one to the face," said the smacker. "How many times do I have to tell you? Keep your head protected. Honestly, for an experienced butt fighter, you can be a real klutz." "I was doing all right," said the kicker. "At getting yourself killed," said the smacker, "or at least rearranged." Zach felt a shiver run down his spine as he remembered what had happened to the butt catcher at the rally. "Excuse me," he said. "Did you say rearranged?" "Yeah," said the smacker, eyeing him suspiciously. "What of it?" Zach hesitated. "Last night," he said, I saw it. I saw someone get rearranged. It was horrible." "You saw a rearrangement," said Eleanor, flashing an alarmed look at the smacker. Zach took a deep breath and told them the whole story. When he'd finished, Eleanor slammed her fist into the palm of her hand. "I knew they were up to something," she said, "but I had no idea it was this big." "You think they're really capable of doing it?" said Zach. "You'd better believe it," said the smacker. "For the last 30 years, we've traveled the world nipping butts uprisings in the bud wherever and whenever they appear. Most butt revolutions amount to little more than just hot air, but it sounds like this one is more organized than most." "And Eleanor," said Zach, "are you part of the B team too?" "Not exactly," she said, "but my father used to be, before he became a full-time butt hunter." "Your father's a butt hunter?" said Zach. "Yeah," she said. "His name is Silas Stern." Zach gasped. He couldn't believe it. This was incredibly good luck. Silas Stern was the one person who could stop his butt and save the world, and he was Eleanor's father. "Where is he?" said Zach. "Can you take me to him? We need to let him know what's happening." Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know where he is," she said. "All I know is that I came home last week and he was gone. No note, nothing. It's not like him at all." Zach gasped again. He couldn't believe it. This was incredibly bad luck. The one person who could stop his butt and save the world was missing. "Do you have any idea where he went?" said the smacker. "Hunting the great white butt," said Eleanor. "Where else?" The very mention of the great white butt sent new shivers down Zach's spine. The great white butt was in a class of its own, a rogue butt, enormous, evil. There was many different theories about where it had come from. Some believed it to be a mutant butt that was created as an accidental side effect of nuclear testing in the Pacific. Some believed it had been around for centuries. One Egyptian scholar had claimed to have discovered hieroglyphics depicting a large white butt. In his book Chariots of the Butts, Eric von Duniken even went so far as to claim that the great white butt was a space traveler who had traveled on Earth and taught ancient butts about butt liberation. Some believed it had been around for even longer than that, a sort of throwback to the age of the dinosaurs that had somehow avoided extinction. Perhaps the first butt ever to grow legs and walk the face of the earth. "So what are we going to do?" said Zach. "We've got to find the butt-cano and plug it up as soon as possible," said the smacker. "Let 'em stew in their own juices." "Give 'em a taste of their own medicine," roared the kicker, who had red cheeks now instead of the deathly white pallor of a few minutes before. Eleanor nodded. "I agree," she said. "Count me in," said the kisser. "Me too," said Zach. "Uh-oh," said Eleanor. "Not you, Zach. We're dropping you off at the nearest butt shelter. This is a job for the professionals." "But what about my butt?" said Zach. "What about it?" she said. "It's my butt," said Zach. "I want it back. I know it's a bit out of control right now, but I'm kind of attached to it." "Not anymore, you're not," said Eleanor. "What you need is a prosthetic butt." "A what?" said Zach. But Eleanor didn't answer him. Instead, she turned around and flung open the lid of one of the padded bench seats that ran along each side of the buttmobile. She rummaged around in the compartment underneath the seat and pulled out a butt, a clear, wobbly silicone butt. She threw it to Zach. "Here," she said, "try this. It's a bit big, but it'll do until you can get properly fitted." "But I don't want a false butt," said Zach, throwing it down on the floor of the buttmobile. "I want my real butt." "Don't be an idiot," said Eleanor. "Real butts are nothing but trouble. Sooner or later, you're going to need to go to the bathroom, and I guarantee you're not going to care what sort of butt you've got." "She's right, you know," said the smacker, picking up the butt and gently putting it back in Zach's hands. "We've all got falsies. They're the safest and the best. Take the butt. You'll need it." So they all have fake butts. That's kind of funny. "I still think I should come with you," said Zach. "No, Zach," said the smacker. "Eleanor's right about that, too. A butt-cano is no place for a civilian, for anyone, for that matter. The odds are against us, but we've all had years of experience in fighting butts. With a bit of luck, we can tip the odds back in our favor, but not with you there, Zach. I'm sorry." "Maybe you're right," said Zach. He gripped the false butt and kneaded it back and forth in his hands. He knew that what Eleanor and the smacker said made sense, but deep down he still felt responsible for all the trouble his butt had caused. It didn't feel right to just do nothing. "Butt shelter ahead," announced the kisser. "Beginning descent. Seatbelts on, everybody." The kicker, Eleanor, and Zach sat down and belted themselves in. The buttmobile dived at a steep angle. Zach could feel his ears popping. He could see through the front windshield that they were heading toward an enormous stainless steel dome with the number 5 painted on the top. A little to the left of it was a landing pad. Zach sat back in his seat and prepared for touchdown. The kicker was bending over, pulling his laces tight. "Any butts trying anything while we're down there? You know what I'll do," he said. "Kick their butts?" said Eleanor. The kicker guffawed and slapped her knee. "You got it," he said. Then, looking at Zach, his smile evaporating, he said, "And if I see any butt sympathizers, I'll kick their butts too." "I am not a butt sympathizer," said Zach, feeling scared again. The kicker could kick butts, that was for sure. He just wished the kicker would stop threatening to kick his. "Buttmobile BH007 to Shelter 5, said the kisser into the handset. "Permission to land requested. Over." The kisser waited and then repeated his request. "That's odd," said the kisser. "What's the matter?" said the smacker. I'm not getting any response, said the kisser. The radio is jammed, but there must be people inside the shelter. The brown flag is up. Land anyway, said the smacker. We'd better check it out. Roger, said the kisser. There was a hissing sound, and the Buttmobile began to descend. The Buttmobile jolted to a stop. Uh-oh, said the smacker. Looks like we've got a welcoming committee. Zack looked out the window. The Buttmobile was surrounded by a group of mean-looking butts, armed with butt trumpets. No wonder we've been having trouble getting through on the radio, said Eleanor. They've been jamming it with high-frequency emissions. Leave them to me. Eleanor crossed the floor to a large black cabinet and opened it. Inside was the most amazing arsenal of butt-hunting weaponry Zack had ever seen. There was every sort of butt-fighting weapon imaginable. Butt guns, spear guns, harpoons, stun guns, and long pointy sticks. Some of the most deadly of all butt-fighting tools. There were butt magnets, butt shields, fluffy pink toilet seat covers, toilet brushes, soaps in plastic holders, clothespins, rolls of sandpaper hanging on a ready-to-roll dispenser, and a full range of deodorizers and disinfectants. Kind of crazy butt-fighting tools. Eleanor replaced her butt blaster in the rack and selected a smaller gun with a large round barrel. A Conspirator 240. Zack recognized it as a clogger. He knew they were good for inhibiting enemy fire. Eleanor clipped it to her belt and pulled down something that looked like a leaf blower. That looks like a leaf blower, said Zack. That's because it is, said Eleanor. You can fight hundreds of butts at a time with a leaf blower. It's also good for cleaning up and clearing the air afterward. Eleanor slung the leaf blower across her shoulder and draped a rack of rubber butt plugs across her chest. Hold it, said the kisser. Let me handle this. Eleanor looked slightly disappointed. Are you sure? She said. Yeah, said the kisser. No point in using up ammunition if it's not strictly necessary. Besides, I could do with the exercise. Well, if you insist, said Eleanor. Oh, but I do, said the kisser. He stood up, applied some fresh lip gloss, and brushed down his suit. Good luck, said Zack. Never fear, he said, over his shoulder as he climbed out of the Buttmobile. The kisser's here. Zack locked the hatch and then sat back down in the cockpit. He watched the kisser approach the circle of butts. They saw him and turned. The kisser bowed very low, so low that his head almost touched the ground. The butts moved in around him, but the kisser made no attempt to escape. Instead, he did something very strange. He began to dance. Zack watched with a mixture of confusion and amusement as the kisser gyrated his hips and swayed from side to side in front of the butts. But as the kisser danced, an even stranger thing began to happen. The butts, as if mesmerized, began to dance with him. They moved slowly from side to side, mimicking his movements with a sort of clumsy grace. Then, without stopping his dance, the kisser began motioning to one of the larger butts to come to him. At first it seemed hesitant, but slowly, almost against its will, it crept forward until it was close enough for the kisser to touch. The kisser then reached out and tickled the butt under its arm. I wasn't expecting that. As the kisser tickled it, the butt seemed to go under an amazing transformation. Its cheeks went bright pink, it blushed, and went weak in its knees. At this point, the kisser reached out and picked it up with both hands. It offered no resistance, brought it to his lips, and kissed it. The butt went limp as if dead, or at least in a faint. The kisser laid it on the ground next to him and began motioning to another butt, which submitted itself to him just as easily as the first. Having charmed the butts, the kisser was now disarming them as if they were no more dangerous than a pack of marauding marshmallows. It didn't take long before he had kissed and immobilized every last butt. They lay in a large pile beside him. Wow, said Zack. That's incredible. Better him than me, said the kicker. There's no way I'd want to kiss a butt. Not in a million years. Zack watched the kisser produce a silver hip flask from inside his jacket, tip his head back, and swill the contents. Then he spat out a mouthful of greenish liquid and dabbed at the corners of his mouth with his white handkerchief. He took another swig and repeated. What's he doing? Said Zack. "Gargling," said the smacker. "I have to wash my hands after fighting butts. The kicker has to polish his boots, and the kisser has to wash his mouth out with industrial-grade disinfectant. As the great butt fighters have always said, if you want to make it as a butt fighter, you have to keep it clean, 'cause it's a dirty business." Eleanor opened the hatch. "Let's go," she said. Climbing out of the buttmobile, the kicker and the smacker followed her. Zach was about to follow them when the radio crackled into life. "Butt Shelter 5 to Buttmobile BH007, said a voice. "Do you copy?" Zach picked up the handset and pushed the button. "Loud and clear," he said. The radio seemed to be working fine now that the butts were out of action and no longer able to jam the airwaves. "What is your position, Buttmobile BH007, said the voice. "We're on the landing pad," said Zach. The voice on the other end spluttered. "You're what?" "You're in extreme danger. Repeat, extreme danger. Do not leave your craft under any circumstances. The whole area surrounding the butt shelter is infested with butts." "It's okay," said Zach. "The B team has them under control." "You're the B team?" said the voice. "The B team?" "Well," said Zach, "I'm not, but the B team is standing on the roof next to the pile of freshly kissed butts." "Unbelievable," said the voice. "We'll be right up." Zach climbed out of the cockpit, out through the hatch, and jumped down onto the landing pad. He walked across to the pile of butts. "Are they dead?" he said to the kisser, who was applying fresh lip gloss to his swollen lips. "No," said the kisser, "just resting. They'll stay like this for a few weeks now. Plenty of time to be relocated to somewhere else where they can't do any harm." "Plenty of time to kick their butts, too," said the kicker, surging forward. "No," said the kisser, stepping between him and the butts. "They're not hurting anybody now. Leave them be." "But they're butts," said the kicker. "Dirty, stinking, rotten, no good, filthy, smelly butts." "Save your energy," said the smacker. "We're going to be needing it. We've still got a long way to go." The kicker looked at the kisser. "Whose side you on anyway?" he snarled. "Isn't it obvious?" said the kisser, dabbing at the corner of his mouth with his handkerchief, which was not quite so white anymore. "Ignore him," said the smacker. "He's spouting more hot air than any of all those butts put together." "Boy, are we glad to see you," said a voice behind them. "Those butts have been giving us trouble all morning." Zach turned around to see a small, officious-looking man. He was dressed like a soldier from World War I. "Welcome to Butt Shelter 5, he said, saluting them. "I'm Captain Vincent Brown. Won't you all come inside? It's crowded, but we've always got room for a few more." "Thanks," said the smacker, "but we've got to keep moving." She put her hand on Zach's shoulders. "We just want to leave young Zach here, if that's okay with you." "Well, that's fine, of course," said the captain. "Any friend of the B team is a friend of ours." Zach turned to the smacker, trying to blink tears. I really wish I could come with you," he said. The smacker put her arm around him. "You have to stay, Zach," she said. "You don't want to get mixed up in the world of butt fighting." "But I'm already mixed up in it," he said. "That's my butt out there. I've got a responsibility to stop it. If anyone can talk it out of this, I can." "No, Zach," said the smacker gently. "You've got a false butt now. Put it on. Forget about your first one. Here, I'll give you a hand. Just loosen your belt a little bit." Zach was too upset to argue. He loosened his belt. The smacker took the false butt from Zach's hands and pushed it down the back of his pants and into place. She patted it gently. "How's that?" she said. Suddenly, Zach was overwhelmed by a powerful urge to go to the bathroom. "Where's the nearest toilet?" he asked Captain Brown. "Just go down the steps and turn right," he said. Zach made it just in time. He was pleased to discover that the false butt worked just like a regular butt. In fact, in at least one way, it was even better. It was self-wiping. Self-wiping butt. Doesn't even have to wipe the butt. It's self-wiping. Maybe the smacker was right, thought Zach. He wondered if he'd be better off staying at the butt shelter with his false butt and forgetting about his real butt. But he couldn't. His butt was trying to take over the world. He couldn't just stay there and pretend it wasn't happening. He had to do something. He knew that the B team wasn't going to allow him to come with them. Not if they knew about it. But what if they didn't know about it? What if he stowed away? Zach figured that all he'd have to do was stay hidden until they'd passed out of the range of any other butt shelters, and then they'd have no choice but to take him. It was worth a try. So Zach climbed back up the steps of the door. At the top of the steps there was an emergency telephone. He wondered whether he should call his gran and let her know that he was all right. If his plan to stow away worked, he might not get another chance, and there was no telling how long he would be away. He didn't know what he would tell her, and he didn't want her to worry. She had had enough to worry about, what with the war and probably her own butt before too long. Zach rang her number. She picked up the receiver after only one ring, as if expecting his call. "Hello?" she said. "Zach, is that you?" "Yes, Gran," said Zach, a bit surprised. "How did you know?" "You weren't in your bed this morning. Is everything all right?" "Sure, Gran," said Zach. "I'm fine." "Really?" said his Gran. "I thought you might have been conscripted." Suddenly Zach had his excuse. It was perfect. "Actually," he said, "I have been conscripted. I might not be home for a while." "And do you know where they're sending you?" she said. "I'm on a secret mission, Gran," he lied. "Can't say too much on the phone." "I quite understand," she said. "Thanks, Gran," said Zach. "I've got to go now." "Well, good luck," she said. "I've got just one piece of advice for you, Zach." "What's that, Gran?" he said. "Don't forget to wash your hands." And then she was cut off. Zach tried to call back, but the line was dead. Why had Gran warned him to wash his hands, he wondered. It was a strange piece of advice to give anybody who was apparently going off to war, unless it was a butt war, of course. But how could she have known that? It was probably just a grandmotherly sort of thing to say, like, look both ways before you cross the street, or remember to brush your teeth. Zach shook his head. Whatever it was, he didn't have time to figure it out now. He had to get on board the Buttmobile while there was still time. So that's the end of chapter 3. So he's going to stow away with the B team and see what happens. And his gran, remember, she keeps talking about some war. And so that was his excuse, so that Gran wouldn't worry about where he was, to tell her that he had been conscripted into the army, like he had to join to be a fighter in the war against the butts. So that worked out kind of perfect for Zach to be able to do that. So very interesting what's going on as we find out when Zach stows away, what's going to happen. What do you think is going to happen when the B team find out that he is a stowaway on the Buttmobile? Probably not going to be very happy. So, well, thank you very much for joining me today for the story. I will look forward to seeing you again the next time that I read The Day My Butt Went Psycho. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you later. Bye, guys.